This is Orsi, official old guy at oldguytalkstome.com, a podcast dedicated to helping older guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. It's for women too. Each week, I bring you a special guest to help you create that life that you imagine for yourself and those that you love. We talk anti-aging medicine, personal growth, relationships, and sex, vices, and other topics that many don't want to talk about but need to. Just because you're getting older doesn't mean you have to be old. Also, if you want to know 3 ways to get laid more frequently without begging, go to oldguytalks.com and opt in. When you do, you're going to get my informative video on 3 simple things you can do to get laid more frequently without begging, so you don't have to turn in your man card. And ladies, you may want your man to know these things, because I think you'll like it too. Additionally, you'll be notified weekly when a new podcast episode is ready for you to consume. Periodically, I will share with you other stuff that will help you create that life that you want for yourself and those that are important to you. Don't want to miss anything? Be sure to subscribe, share, and review this podcast. This is Orsi, official old guy at oldguytalkstome.com, a podcast dedicated to helping older guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. And sometimes it talks about stuff that's, well, controversial. And we are right in the middle of it about this stuff. Depending on when you hear this program, it's going to be before or after the Olympics, but we certainly got some controversy going down there. And today I have an androgen specialist, Dr. Scott Howell. He's a former professor and PhD faculty member in the School of Health and Human Services at Trident University. He is an epidemiologist, an exercise physiologist, and mechanical engineer with current research interests in the long-term effects of therapeutic androgen use and endocrine disrupting chemical exposure. He is a recipient of the prestigious AMU Academic Scholar Award and has worked on 2 major NIH and DoD funded studies at Wake Forest University: straight training for Arthritis Trial and the Runners and Injury Longitudinal Study trials. And he's also currently, or has worked with the U.S. Powerlifting Association on preparing their position paper on transgender athletes. And so
Yes.
so we are when we first talked about that, we talked a few weeks ago before we could get our schedules together, but I did not realize that it was going to be so timely in the news right now. So Scott, thanks for coming on the program again. This is a 3rd time appearance. You should get an award for me or something. We'll have to figure something out. But you don't smoke cigars. That's a problem.
That's a good one. Awesome.
So I'm just gonna ask the question, then we're gonna get into some specifics. Do men who have transitioned to women have an advantage in sports over biological females? And if so, can it be quantified, or is it quantified? Tell us a little bit about what you found.
Well, there's a lot of angles with this because it gets so deep on all the biological characteristics, what actually makes the phenotype of a male compared to a female, and even disorders of where there's an extra XXY, for example, like in Klinefelters and stuff like that. So it gets like a tricky situation, even when you talk about PCOS, because if someone has PCOS or congenital adrenal hyperplasia in women, then they have an excess amount of androgens. And so that can be taken to confer a performance advantage. But the main thing is beyond the effects of the hormones, it's maturating in a male sex. So when you go through the period of sexual differentiation, I believe that's 6 to 9 weeks at human life during that period, where the brain maturates, as well as the sexual characteristics are really being influenced all the way up till you go through puberty. And then after puberty, for quite a while, there's still changes that are going on. And so when we talk about the performance advantage, it is basically, in my mind, it can be quantified just by maturating in the biological sex of a male.
Mhm.
Now, there's some compelling reasons on the other side as far as how a gender identity can be influenced by endocrine disruptors.
Mhm.
And so someone that's had a previous exposure to endocrine disruptors, they could be in the situation where their brain centers for sexual maturation have been changed. They've been altered. And this has been demonstrated before in experiments. So there was one study, and I'm trying to think of it. It was in the late 1990s that came out. I believe it was in Nature. And what they did was they identified the actual structure in the brain responsible for sexual differentiation. And what they found was that when they looked at transsexuals, male transsexuals, and they looked at normal women and normal males, that first, the men, normal men compared to normal women, this structure was completely different. But when you looked at the structure of transsexuals, male transsexuals compared to females, they were identical. And so that brain structure was changed. Now, so that's a reason for one biological reason for the other side. Now, as far as a performance advantage, when we ran the analysis through USA Powerlifting, we used publicly available data just to show what the spread was between males and females in their respective categories.
Mhm.
And then we looked at what the hormone therapy could do to reduce that performance advantage. And what we found was that even when there's hormone treatment to drive down those numbers, that there's still so much an advantage that's higher than what it would be from anabolic steroid use.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's pretty profound. I mean, we looked at every category, and the amount, the distance between those two bell curves was so far apart. It is in pure strength sports, there is hands down, there is a performance advantage. And if someone says there's not, they're completely ignoring um, biological fact. And I'm not saying that to be rude to anybody or anything, but we've come into a position where biological sex is being ignored. And
Mhm.
it's okay if it's someone wants to identify because there's a justifiable reason to do that.
Mhm.
But if we talk about fair inclusion into sport, the only way that we could figure out how to have fair inclusion in the sport was to make a completely separate division
Right.
for
Okay.
that. And that was the only way. And interestingly enough, when we sent that paper out to peer review, we got tired of submitting it because it was rejected right out the gate
Oh, I bet. I bet. I
for
mean,
about 2 years.
probably not something that people wanted to hear because of the social pressure. It's amazing that people. I think when people talk about, well, it's the science, and they don't. A lot of times people don't realize how political science can actually be. That it really succumbs, especially now in these areas, because I'm sure that people would be with this position, they could risk their tenure, all sorts of stuff. Be basically cast out into exile and at the in a university
Mhm.
and all that. If they started saying these kind of things, even though they may be even though they're factually correct. So there's a big price to be paid for speaking the truth in this arena.
We
So
actually had a colleague that worked on one of the initial papers and then part of the write up, the discussion. He was let go of his tenured position at a major university for writing an op ed on it. And so he lost his whole tenure and basically his career, but then that set him on a firestorm to, speak his mind about what was out there. And, to me, it's even in the university now, there's a push towards neutral language. And if you're conducting a study where there's biological sex has importance and you're going to change the word to gender, which is really a social construct. I mean, if someone identifies, it's not that They don't have a reason, a biological reason to identify as a female for whatever reason. We've already went over that. But to ignore that in a purely scientific paper is, in my mind, it's science
Yeah.
is turning a blind eye now because
Yeah.
of all the deans and the institutions.
Yeah, and it seems like what we're doing is we're taking a minority, and we're basically pushing this onto the majority of people, even though they're not really wanting to have this whole thing pressed on them. So, and when you talk about, there's a concept called about retained benefits of androgens and steroids. Can you talk about that a little bit, especially like in this particular case where Laurel Hubbard, who is going to be an Olympic powerlifter in the women's super heavyweight division, and the transition was at age 35, and they're competing at a 43-year-old, which I'm not, my understanding is that's kind of old for a power lifter in the women's area to be competing. That's actually probably pretty old for a lot of power lifters. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not familiar with it. But could you talk a little bit about what kind of advantage she may have now over the other athletes at this point?
Well, I'm not sure if I can make a comparison to anabolic steroids or exogenous hormones, but one of the effects of exogenous hormones is that they increase the myonuclei in the muscles. And so you have this myonuclear transfer that can repair tissue more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the reasons why the trapezius and deltoids always blow up on guys that are women that take anabolic steroids, because those tissues have a higher density there. Mm-hmm. And so they respond quicker. Now, as far as the retained benefits, if you look at the structure of the bones, number one, there's a higher VO2 max, there's a higher lung capacity.
Can you talk about can you explain what VO2 max is for our audience?
Well, VO2 max is it's the maximum amount of oxygen that can be taken up, and there's specific ways of looking at what that VO2 max is, and a lot of times I'm running into a blank right now. I can visualize it in my head. It's not a Wingate, but regardless, it's one of the things where males on average have a higher VO2 max than females, and that's just across the board. They also have a higher, on average, hematocrit and red cell count. Now, if you look at that, would be more performance advantage for someone that's an endurance sport, right? But on the other hand, if you look at pure strength, right, what we're talking about here now, she's an Olympic lifter, is that correct?
Yeah, she's going to the Olympics for New Zealand, and so that's the story there. They're talking about displacing women who are biologically women off the team, and because before she competed as a woman, she was actually an elite lifter in the males, not world class, not Olympic world class, but elite that go and do shows and things like that. But now all of a sudden, with this transition and competing in the women's section, now it's world class, Olympic class.
Well, the issue again is about maturating in the male sex fully. So the bone structure, if you think about it, the rate limiting factor in anyone for pure strength is going to be the skeleton, the ligaments, and the muscles that hold the muscles and the ligaments and fascia that hold everything together. Now, if you think about maturating and you have a higher type 2 fiber type distribution, I mean, that's suited well for absolute strength and performance. Now, here the thing is, when you maturate your neural drive to a certain extent, your motor recruitment capacity that you have, and all the like one motor unit and all the motor or the muscle fibers it innervates, those are relatively fixed. You can have hypertrophy of muscle fibers, but hyperplasia hasn't really been demonstrated in human studies to an extent, even with muscle biopsies of bodybuilders and stuff like that. But if you have a higher force generation capacity, then that means that you're coming in on a higher level, a higher threshold than someone that maturated as a female, because the bone structure is not going to be as large. The amount of type 2 myofibers is likely a higher proportion. It goes back to that, and the conditioning effects of androgens after someone is maturated in a certain sex can be differential. And a lot of this is predicated even on genetic polymorphisms. So you can have.
Okay, you're talking a little bit above my head. So what do you mean? What do you mean by that? That after they can change. What does that mean?
Could you state that again? I'm sorry.
When you were talking about how after they maturate, there's still some benefits that go on. So what to being that, even though they may transition to female.
Well, there's a concept called hormonal imprinting, and it's I learned about this concept from the EDC's research, endocrine disruptors, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And basically, when you go through the process of maturation, there can be imprinting of different hormones to go down a certain pathway. And that's with mimics. But as far as this situation with this individual, if you are maturated to respond to androgens, number one, as a male, you're going to have a higher androgen receptor content. And the amount of androgen receptors that you express at any one given time is going to have a limit, and the androgen receptor gene autoregulates that process. But the threshold is way higher. Now, even in a low androgen environment, there could be enough stimulation to give a performance enhancement advantage if, in fact, the levels were just lowered or even circulating.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that because somebody is and I'm just going to take the real simple one, is a double X or an XY, the testosterone is going, even though if the testosterone, let's say, is at the same low level, it will have more of it can have more of an effect, or likely will have more of an effect for someone that's an XY. So would you're just measuring, if you're just measuring levels, it doesn't tell you about what the performance capabilities are. Is that correct?
Right. And so when you, a lot of the things that's missing out of the position statements is the genetic influence over this, of the genetic performance enhancement of just being a biological male, and the ability to respond to androgens. The sensitivity is based on one trinucleotide repeat, or actually it's thought to be two different repeats, but one is the main one is called the CAG repeat. And if you have a short length of this repeat on the androgen receptor gene, then you have more sensitivity to androgens. And as it gets longer and longer, you have a decreased sensitivity until it becomes pathologic, like Kennedy's disease, Klinefelter syndrome, things like that. So if you had a short CAG repeat, and even though you lowered your levels, you would still respond to that circulating level higher than someone with a longer repeat. And so it's just, there's so many factors that have to be taken into consideration when you're talking about fair play. And controlling the hormone levels is not really where I see that there's it's being fair across the board. I mean, it's not, because it ignores so many other factors. And
so Scott, I just got a quick question. Do women have a CAG repeat? Or
yes.
Okay. So, but theirs would be because it's because they're XY. Theirs would be longer. It's because it reacts to testosterone differently.
Well, the issue there is they can respond. I just don't know of any. I don't know of any studies that have examined it in females like they have males. And so there's a lack of literature on that. Now, I know that the CAG repeat has been examined in PCOS patients. It's been examined there. But even that condition, PCOS, if you're
PCOS is, I'm sorry,
polycystic ovarian syndrome.
Okay.
Yeah. And congenital adrenal hyperplasia is another one, where there's an excess amount of androgens. And so if you look at women that have the latter disorder, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, what happens, even when they're kids, they have a preference for playing with male toys. They're more aggressive than normal female girls at that period. And then later on, they start to not be interested in the feminine appearance. And that's just characteristics that's known about that disorder. But the point here is that there's a plethora of disorders that could technically, if we want to consider fair play, could disqualify someone for having a performance advantage over completely what do you establish as normal. And so that's what you get back to. I know the runner, I forgot the name, the one runner that was in the news that had
right. Yeah, I know who I know who you talk about, but I can't remember her name. That she had naturally occurring high testosterone levels.
Yes. And so it gets an ethical dilemma there as well.
Yeah, this is a complex topic. It has lots of things. I think you shared a lot of stuff that I think a lot of people don't know about this. And this may seem like a very basic question, but is the testosterone that men produce naturally different from the testosterone that women produce naturally, or are they essentially the same?
No, they're substantially different. Women, I forget the exact amounts, but it's, I would say men are close to 10 times higher than women on testosterone on a daily basis for production. And so a lot of the testosterone in women is converted from adrenal hormones,
right?
DHEA, in that conversion pathway to androstenedione, and then on to testosterone. So there's some testosterone, I believe, that's produced in the ovaries. I don't know if it's a what is the word I'm looking for? If it's produced locally or if it's through enzymatic conversion, but the total amount is substantially lower in females than it is for males.
Yeah, but is it quantitatively it's significantly different? Is it qualitatively the same? Is it the same type of testosterone that's produced by men versus women? Is that the same I guess I'd say the same hormone?
Yes, but in men, it's predominantly produced in the Leydig cells of the testes. And so it's produced in a certain, usually in, I can't remember how many milligrams per day, but in women, the bulk of testosterone comes from indirect conversion. And women also have the aromatase enzyme, so they convert some of that to estradiol, just like men do. We both have the aromatase gene. It's thought to evolve parallel with the androgen receptor. And so, yeah, the testosterone is equivalent of what's produced in the female body. It's just maybe the pathways are different.
Okay, all right. Did you know that there are 76 additives that have been approved by the FDA that can be added to wines? You want a wine with shit in it that may not be good for you? Well, there is an option for wines that have been produced naturally, organically, that have been tested, that have no sugar. And when they don't have any sugar, that means that they're ketosis and intermittent fasting friendly. These wines have been produced with a great deal of care on small farms and are available to you. How do you get them? Find out by going to www.oldguytalks.com/dry farms, all one word with an S, and find out more. And with your initial order, you can get a bottle for 1 penny. That's right, a bottle for 1 penny. And they taste great. They taste great. Don't wait, don't hesitate. Don't procrastinate. Get those wines now. So you've alluded to this, and I want to kind of it's kind of along this path, but take a little different thing. Talked about endocrine disrupting compounds,
Mhm.
and there are very many studies now that have talked about, and we'll say testosterone and sperm, but I want to focus mostly on testosterone, that the generational levels of testosterone are going down significantly. And the male normative aging study was one of the biggest ones. They had a big study on that in terms of showed that. But the labs, and I don't know if I don't know when the last time you got your labs. I just had my labs done, and the ranges have dropped again.
Really?
Yeah, they're the ranges are used to be in the about 1100 or so,
Hmm.
and the new normal high is 964.
964. Well, that's close to um, 4 or 5 months ago when I had tested through LabCorp. Now, how far back has it been since you got labs?
This is I think it's about a year ago. So a year ago, I think it was 1100. As I look through my records, but I get tested twice a year, just for full disclosure for everybody here. I've been on testosterone optimization therapy for a long time, for about 26 years. So I got a lot. I have a lot of I have a lot of lab reports to look at. But yeah, no, they dropped down again. And I was talking to someone that we both know, and he was telling me that 15 years ago, that if you looked at those same lab ranges, the normal range, the upper end of the normal range was been right about 1500, which would be considered super physiologic at this point. But it just shows how. How much it's changed. The doctor who does those ranges, his name is Travison. Are you familiar
Oh
with him?
yeah. Well, there's an ironic story about Travison because in
Okay.
2007 he initiated the alarm with endocrine disruptors, decreasing by 1.6% per year that was age independent. Um, Even when it was compared to cross section, each cross section of what they
Mhm.
measured, it was still higher. But then in 2017, on one day, you could have had a level that was what, say, 1300, and on the very next day, with that same level, you would have been about 200 to 300 nanograms per deciliter off the top end, too high.
Mhm.
And
Right.
so you would be titrated back down by a clinician because of that. But it was ironic that he was the one that harmonized the reference intervals in
Mhm.
2017, and he
Yeah.
used the cohorts from the U.S., the cohorts from Europe, and if you're harmonizing something, shouldn't you account for the declines that we're seeing, because it's not healthy? Even in his first paper, he indicated there was an unknown environmental exposure that was undocumented but persistent. And
Mhm.
if it was a health related issue or a lifestyle factor issue, it had to be simultaneous with that birth cohort,
Mhm.
each birth cohort. So it's
Yeah.
sort of a far stretch, but the results of that study have been replicated in about 15 other studies in
Yeah.
Brazil and Israel, other places. It's compelling. It really is.
Well, I think it was interesting. I saw a communication between him and someone else, where basically his comment on the ranges is that he said that this is epidemiological data, and it's not meant to be treat individual patients, which was
Well,
which is an interesting comment from the
well, you
guy who
know,
puts the ranges out there.
well, you harmonize them, and then all of a sudden, all the guidelines change.
Right.
And
Right.
so, I mean, it's one of those things where, what did you think would happen? But I don't hold him accountable because I know he's a researcher and it is epidemiological data. I
Mhm.
mean, all those studies, even the Anderson study in 2007 that replicated Travison in Europe, went back like 60 years. Um, that was all based off samples from cohorts that were stored. So I agree.
Yeah. So because you're obviously very knowledgeable in androgens, and that's your field of specialization. What do you see going on developmentally in young men these days, in terms of there was reports that young men in their 20s and 30s are showing up with lower baseline levels for testosterone therapy than people in their 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what do you think is the effect of that on developmentally on boys and young men?
Well, I think number one, we cannot ignore the environmental exposure to EDCs. It's real.
Yeah.
It's there. The evidence is there. If you take the bulk of the literature and you look at it, you just take like 2 hours to look through some good systematic reviews. It is so compelling that you have to open your eyes. But what's going on, I believe, is that there's transgenerational effects. So if a mother is exposed to certain endocrine disruptors in the prenatal period or in the perinatal period, yeah, that's right, perinatal period, that there are changes that are transferred that are permanent. And so when it's almost like an epigenetic bridge, you have something that influences a change in utero, and then those changes start to become transgenerational. They start to affect every generation. And so if you look at the Boston cohort, the male aging study in Boston, where Travison did his stuff, there is a distinct cohort effect. And if you look at the Anderson study, there's a distinct cohort effect there, because the oldest cohorts had the highest testosterone levels. And then the newest cohorts, they had the lowest testosterone levels. So it's sort of bizarre in how those cohort effects are there. There's no way to actually determine what caused it, because it has to be measured to adjust it in an analysis to see what the effect is. And so I have personally talked to probably hundreds of men that are in their mid 20s, close to 30, that have testosterone levels that are way insufficient. I'm talking about 300 or below. And they come to you, and the first thing that you query them on, have you been taking anabolic steroids? Have you been doing this or that? And for most, it is not anabolic steroids. They're just their levels are low. And if you look at like the fertility studies that have been done, the total sperm count has dropped about 1.6%, the total sperm count. Well, that's almost in line with the percent decrease in testosterone levels, 1.6% per year. And so there's a real effect there. And it's affecting a lot of young men.
Yeah,
it is.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the paper written by Levine et al. and Shauna Swan, and a number of others, and they did the extrapolation about the slope of the sperm decline, and they said that by 2050, most men in the world, and they used to say just in the industrialized world, but Dr. Swan in her book changed that because it's starting to affect the non-industrial world, will be infertile by 2050. Because that slope is not abating.
Well, the interesting thing is the sex ratio is shifting in the opposite direction. Instead of being skewed towards higher males, it used to be the ratio was 106 males to every 100 female births. And that has been continually dropping. And there was a study in one of the earliest studies I know that examined that, I think was in 1998 or 99. It was published in JAMA. And they're talking about how the shift in sex ratio is changing. Now, in most mammalian species, it's a 1-to-1. But in humans, it was initially believed it was skewed a little bit higher in males. Well, now it's flipping in the opposite direction. And so now on one hand, the fertility of males is dropping, and so is the birth rate of males dropping.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Swan in her book also talked about that actually the female eggs are not as healthy as they used to be, again, because of endocrine disrupting compounds. that they're certainly not as healthy as they used to be in the past. Because of that, so I think we're going to be seeing a lot of things going on. You know, I'm a great believer in testosterone optimization. I would say because I've been doing it for 27 years. If you're doing something for 27 years, you really believe it. But what I wanted to ask you, when there have been times I've gone off of my testosterone for various reasons. International travel is probably the biggest one.
Right. It's hard to take it with you, right?
Yeah, it's hard to take it with you. And if you go for 3 weeks, it's the half-life of testosterone cyprinate is 8 to 10 days. And if you're on a 3-week trip, well, you're back in the low levels very quickly. And it was very interesting that my wife, when I was in New Zealand with my youngest daughter, we were there for about 3 weeks, and like about day 8, I'm on the phone with my wife. She goes like, "What's wrong with you? Like, you sound cranky." Like, and then she's like, "Did you take your testosterone with you?" And I go, "No." She goes, "Wow, you're really cranky." And I say that because I'm going to ask you this question. We have a lot of this gender dysphoria that seems to be it seems to be growing, and I don't know how much it's societal or what, but do you think that the low testosterone in males could be a factor? Because a lot of times they talk about depression, and I know that I become really down if I'm not on my testosterone. Do you think that might be a factor in that?
Well, yes, it could, because in the perinatal period, if the in utero a female fetus is flooded with androgens, then if it's during those certain periods, then they will develop their brain structure is different. I mean, they're developing different in brain structure. And that's the first thing that I was telling you about early on.
Right.
But the opposite can happen with males too. If there's a conditioning effect, there's not enough androgen stimulation when it needs to be there, it definitely could play a role. And when you throw endocrine disruptors in and you have the ability to hormonally imprint, meaning that you change the actual function of the hormone and the receptor start to change because there's exposure during that period, then you have long-term effects that last for the life of the organism. And so it's one of the things, tamoxifen, DES, RU486, there's a bunch of others. Those have been shown to hormonally imprint in rats. So the experiments, like if you give tamoxifen during this period of maturation, sexual maturation.
What's tamoxifen? I'm not familiar with that.
Tamoxifen is it's a estrogen receptor. It's a selective estrogen receptor modulator. It's a SERM. When that's given to these rats in this perinatal period, it completely abolishes the sexual activity of adult male rats and adult female rats. On the other hand, if you give RU486 to these rats, that's a progesterone blocker. It increases the sexual activity of adult male rats significantly, but non-significantly increases the female sexual activity as well. So just because it didn't reach statistical significance, probably because of the amount of rats that they had in the experiment, but it still shows a trend. And so that's two opposing examples of what can happen. But that's the concept of hormonal imprinting was sort of interesting to me, because when I first saw it, I'm thinking, and actually there's a fellow, I'm trying to think of his name. His name is, actually he might've been on that one study that you mentioned with Levine, McEwen.
I don't have it handy, but yeah, because there's like 4 or 5 published authors on that.
What he said, he was talking about the brain endocrine axis, And he said he described it as being in a delicately balanced state during development. And he went on to say that exogenous mimics like endocrine disruptors play havoc with brain development and differentiation. And he's talking about sexual differentiation right there.
Mm.
And so if you look at the correlates of that with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, what happens to women that have that disorder, they are flooded with androgens.
Mm-hmm.
And so it changes
Sure.
their brain. And I'm not sure, I was trying to think if there's studies on PCOS too with that, but it's not to the same degree as congenital adrenal hyperplasia. That was the only real example that I could think of to sort of show a correlation there of what could happen.
Yeah. So, what was the? I'm kind of going to circle back to kind of where we started. Could you kind of? You said that you had some hard times. Yeah, you had a hard time getting your paper published. You kept on getting rejected, and you eventually did get it published. Is that correct?
No, it hasn't been published.
Oh, it hasn't been. Oh my gosh.
No,
Okay.
no. It's the only thing that's that has went through the pipeline. I believe, and I'll say this because I know he won't mind. I believe Dr. Hunt had worked on a review paper to one journal, but no, it was completely rejected to every institution in the U.S. and abroad.
Wow.
That it was sent to.
And so much for following the science. As we have been lectured on for months during this COVID thing. So that actually is quite startling. Actually, I'm glad I came back around to that, because it's unfortunate that's the case. So yeah, so. Now, is there an official position from the U.S. Powerlifting Association? What's their position now at this point on trans athletes?
Their position is that they don't allow transgender inclusion because number one, if you look at Dr. Hunt, he has a YouTube video where we first prepared the manuscript, and then he's presenting some of the findings. But he's talking, and there's some other people that are going to debate him and stuff. It's on YouTube. But there's not really a rational debate. It's all just completely sort of one-sided when we start debating about it, because emotions fly high. And the position statement, I believe, I want to say this on a record, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that the position statement is they do not allow. And that's one of the reasons why that I believe that they were either threatened with litigation, or they are currently undergoing litigation right now.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the end. Unfortunately, litigation is a way of our life, and I would encourage your friend who lost his tenured position. His only answer now is litigation, and because people are so tired of it, and you're just hearing more and more stories about people litigating it and winning. That's the thing, is they're winning.
Well, the thing is, I do understand a biological basis for it. Mm-hmm. And I do, and increasing numbers as well. But on the same hand, in my mind, the people that should be upset are the women that are competing.
Right.
Because if they're at a disadvantage out the gate, and they're really trying, they have a scholarship online or whatever, and they're getting kicked out of that, then it just doesn't seem fair. There has to be a way that all this can be dealt with in a reasonable manner.
Yeah, well, again, people are afraid of the social stigma, but even now, as I was doing my research for this, for our conversation today, people are speaking out. Women powerlifters are speaking out about Laurel Hubbard competing in the female category, and you're starting again seeing litigation around the United States about this. I know there's a couple cases in New York and other states that's really coming up and being an issue. And yes, I think that it's, there's a reason why there's men's sports and there's women's sports. And, just, basketball, I'll just tell you, because my daughters, my, my one daughter played quite a bit. And up until about 12 or 13, they played with boys. And she was on for a while. She was on a club team that was particularly good, and they would go to the Y, and they'd beat the boys soundly. I mean, it was like, and they were like, they were like, it was. I think they also surprised them because they were all very prissy, and they had their nails down and had their hair up, but boy, all of a sudden, a boy would be dribbling down the court, he'd be surrounded by three girls, just all over him, grabbing the ball and things like that, and she's elbowing me, like, you know, uh, but after that, once the boys' testosterone kicks in, the
Mhm.
boys' game goes vertical. The women's game is, I mean, it isn't. It's not that it's not completely vertical, because, like, in college and everything else, there is, but it's so much more vertical once the boys get their testosterone, just because they can jump higher, because they have, this and that. So but until then, it's a lot of times they're on a similar path. Um, so, Scott, I want to thank you for coming on. I learned a lot. I guess the thing that I learned the most about was that there was actually a brain component to being trans. That there was a component. I think that's probably I think that's probably the thing that would really surprise most of us in this. That there's actually a biological basis in terms of brain activity.
Well, there is. I mean, it's if you look at the experiments that have done, it's biological plausibility. It's there. Now, we can't say that just because something happened in rats that it's going to be fully
Right.
expressed in humans. But what models do we use in cardiology and stuff? I mean, we have to start somewhere. And
Hmm.
so the biological plausibility is there. And so, in my mind, it's not. Some individuals wouldn't have a choice in this. They would automatically identify as a female and feel uncomfortable in their body. That's what the evidence shows towards that. Does it hold up in humans? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Does that mean that uh, um, there's not a that fair play can't be extended? Well, the only way that we could find in our minds after looking at everything was to create another category.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of times that's insufficient because and it goes back to Title IX too.
Hmm. Yeah. The it's interesting because, it because of what's going on. It's such a heated topic that it's hard for people to be reasonable about this, because you're branded as whatever. I get branded so many times. I don't really, at this point, I really don't care. It just doesn't.
I understand.
It doesn't
I
bother. I don't
understand.
care. I'm just too old to worry about that. But it's a whole interesting phenomenon. But, the basic factor is that two things can be true at the same time, and this is what people often try to pretend it's not. Yes, there is a brain function that is altered or is changed, or however you want, or however you want to say it, that makes someone trans, and at the same time they have a biological advantage, especially if they have matured for many years as a male and then competing as a female. And then there's this whole thing, which we don't have time to get into today, but uh, gender changes in young kids. And what I was going to say is that I can't remember where the statistics came from. I think it's actually from the American Academy of Pediatricians, that of those children that have gender dysphoria as young children, that about 85% of them are comfortable with the sex that they're born with. Well, when they get past puberty and developmentally and get into their later teen years, that they're actually, it's a significant of it is how should I say, goes towards your sex birth. Yeah, about,
Mhm.
I think it was, the number was 85%, which is an interesting thing. Which is and a whole nother thing. And I'll just mention, there's several articles about how you start middle aging kids if you start giving them hormone blockers when they're pre-puberty. It's just andropause and menopause are the two words that are used in that, and so it's a very interesting phenomenon. So Scott, I want to thank you for coming on board. And if somebody wants to get in contact with you, how would they do that?
They can contact me through ScholarWorks, and that's an X instead of S, ScholarWorks at gmail.com, or androgenresearch@gmail.com. I still do consultations and things like that in men's health, but mostly data analysis and consulting.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the consultations you do in terms of men's health?
Well, with some of these, like with genetics, if the individuals have their genetic files, or even if they don't, I have a platform that I can use and have their SNP analysis done. And then I can show them a favorable performance enhancement SNPs that they have, things about metabolism of different vitamins and nutrients, things like that, overall health. And also, I started here, it's been 4 or so months now, consulting with physicians on optimizing testosterone replacement therapy and going through that. So it's really no holds barred when you have a consult. But also with anabolic steroid users, they want to reduce their harm, then I'll have their genetics done and map out what direction they can take to reasonably try to monitor their health instead of killing themselves at an early age.
Sure. Okay. Well, I thank you. This has been fascinating. I think we had covered a lot of new territory, learned a lot of stuff, and hopefully brought some sanity to this discussion, though I doubt that that's the case.
I doubt it too.
I doubt it too. We can all hope for sanity and common sense, but I don't expect it. It's like, I think the operative word is hope, but I'm not expecting it anytime soon. So once again, thank you. This is Orsi Official Old Guy at oldguytalkstome.com. Until next time, be sure to subscribe, share, rate, and review. Until next time, thanks for joining me on this podcast. If you like what you heard and learned, then be sure to do 3 things. 1, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. 2, share this with someone who may need to hear it also, and it may be your significant other. And 3, review it. Give me a good review. If you didn't like it, give me a bad review. I don't care. Just review me. And be sure to get my free video on 3 ways to get laid more frequently without begging. Opt in at oldguytalks.com. Don't be that guy that just takes in the information. Take action. Without action, you're not going to get the results you want.